99.9 KTDY, the best variety of the 80s, 90s, and today. And Lady Gaga, she is at Prince Albert Hall with Tony Bennett right now on tour.
Wow.
It is 8:17, Siege and Deb, and the doc's in. Dr. Kevin with the Bryant Wellness Institutes of Acadiana. It's Wellness Wednesday. Happens about this time. We're a little bit late today, Doc. Sorry about that. Every Wednesday. So what are we talking about today?
Well, today I wanted to discuss ways to reduce systemic inflammation in the body. And I've mentioned that several times on the show in the past, how, a lot of our chronic diseases are caused by chronic systemic inflammation. And in fact, this is very important because this is the number one killer of Americans by far. Now, most people think, well, wait a minute, heart disease and cancer is the number one killer of Americans. But chronic systemic inflammation is the precursor to those things. So if you back up the heart disease, if you back up the cancer, chronic inflammation is the precursor. So it is by far the number one killer of Americans. And listen, we have one of the worst death rates of any country in the modern world. Even with all the doctors and hospitals and diets and gyms and money spent on healthcare, we still die sooner than almost any other country in the industrialized world, and chronic inflammation is the cause of this issue. And
so it's not because married men want to.
Stop.
No.
Okay.
No.
That's just a little, that's an ugly rumor?
Yeah,
okay.
I think
All
so,
right.
yeah. It might, in some cases, it might be the case, yeah.
So how do you get all this inflammation, Dr. Kevin?
Well, we normally think of inflammation as, okay, I have a sprained ankle or I have arthritis in my hands and they're inflamed.
Mm-hmm.
This is different. Chronic systemic inflammation is that our whole body's chemistry changes, and it's a very complex cellular problem that goes on. It's going to be hard to explain on the radio, but what it does, inflammatory signals to your body create the pathway for cells to develop chronic disease.
Okay.
So chronic systemic inflammation causes a lot of cellular changes in our body that lead to us developing most chronic diseases. And it's becoming increasingly obvious that, and I've been saying this for years, but it's proving to be true, that this systemic inflammation is the precursor to heart disease, cancer, obesity, digestive problems, arthritis, diabetes, and even the new studies on Alzheimer's is being linked to chronic systemic inflammation over the years. And I feel that even arterial plaquing, like somebody has plaque in their arteries, is much more caused from systemic inflammation than it is from eating too many eggs or eating too much cholesterol. All the studies are starting to catch up and prove that this is the case. So
is it just something in your genes, or is it an allergy?
Well, it's actually from mostly the food that we eat.
Really?
And the things that it's environmental.
Wow.
It's much less to do with genetics and much more to do with what we have in our surroundings and what we put in our bodies. And so, as you'll see today, the typical American diet is the perfect inflammatory diet. I couldn't create a diet that was more pro-inflammatory than, if I tried to, than the typical American diet. So here are the top foods that create this deadly inflammatory response in the body. Now, the first one is what I call the 3 Ps, which is packaged, processed, and pre-prepared foods. So this is the foods that come in a box, the packaged foods, the foods that are pre-prepared, like the lunch meals that you stick in the microwave for lunch, the little quick meals that you bring to work that are frozen.
Hot Pockets.
Yeah, exactly. Those kind of things. The drive-thrus, these foods are loaded with the complete list of inflammatory markers. Many times the ingredients list is 100% pro-inflammatory. The chemicals, the preservatives, the hydrogenated oils, the artificial colorings and flavorings, all of this is very pro-inflammatory in our bodies. Number 2 on the list is hydrogenated and trans fats like margarines, shortenings. These products make the baked cookies, the pies, the chips, the crackers, these things. Margarine, back in the 80s, margarine was the answer to heart disease.
Oh, gosh, in the 60s.
Yeah, in the 60s and 70s. Margarine was one of the worst mistakes that we have ever made. If anybody is still eating margarine out there, please switch back to a organic grass-fed butter. So much better for you than margarine. Margarine is one of the most pro-inflammatory things for our arteries and for our heart. So margarine is not a healthy alternative to real butter, by far. Number 3 on the list is our meats that we eat. Typical beef and pork is real high in omega-6 inflammatory fats. It also is loaded with hormones, pesticides, and other vaccines and drugs, all of them very, very inflammatory. Now, things like grass-fed organic beef doesn't count, wild-caught fish doesn't count, and and deer that is from the wild all have very anti-inflammatory properties, so they're not on the list here. But just your typical hamburger meat that you buy, your typical beef and pork that you buy, it has high omega-6 in it.
Had a hamburger steak last night. Thanks, Doc.
So if you think about this, grass-fed beef has grass-fed organic beef has as much healthy omega-3s as wild-caught salmon does.
Wow.
Yeah, so you wouldn't realize that. So it's not so much, oh, I'm eating beef. It's what that animal ate that matters.
But at $25 a pound
Yeah.
or whatever it costs,
Exactly.
you can really restrict your portion size to the sizes that you're supposed to eat because it's so expensive.
Exactly.
So
Yes.
it's a win-win, right?
Yes, exactly right. And wild-caught salmon as well. That stuff is not cheap for sure. But, what I found in my house is when we do invest in better quality foods, you don't waste near as much, because you have a tendency to cook what you're going to use.
Yeah, that's true.
And you have a tendency to use your leftovers. So we have very little food waste. And, most of the time people throw away, when they add up what they throw away.
Folks in Acadiana throw away a lot of food.
Yeah, and so if you invest more in the food that you buy and you make sure that you eat what you buy, it really it counteracts some of the costs there. Now, number 4 on the list, this is the biggest one. This is the biggest one on the list, is sugars and sweeteners, including artificial sweeteners. This is probably one of the biggest contributors to Americans' development of all of these chronic diseases that causes us to die early, and it's it feeds inflammation and cancer. Sugar, Americans eat 180 pounds of sugar a year. And that's like a fully grown adult. So, that's too much sugar. And then number 5 on the list is the genetically modified foods. Anytime you take a soybean and you splice on part of a virus DNA onto the DNA of a soybean, and then on the other end you splice on part of a bacteria DNA to that, so it's kind of what we call a frankenfood. It's not necessarily... It's not necessarily the best thing as far as preventing inflammation in the body. So,
how do you know if your food is GMO?
Well, there's a big argument right now that is it going to be labeled or not.
Yeah.
And if it's not labeled non-GMO at this point in our food, you can pretty much bet that it is. Any kind of corn that they make chips out of, if it's corn or soy or wheat, and it's not labeled non-GMO, it is probably genetically modified in some way. And I'm a firm believer that at the very least they ought to have to label it. But there's a lot of political money to have it not labeled as GMO. Monsanto and some of these other big food giant companies, they donate a lot of money to our senators and our congressmen to not to have laws that are in their favor and not in the favor of the person who's eating it. So we have to keep an eye on those things. But we can all make some simple changes in our diet and prevent chronic disease if we just sort of make this more of a priority, and if we'll care enough to be proactive about making these changes. And so, here's the thing. A lot of times people say, oh, well, I can't do that all the time. I'm just not even going to try. Okay, well, do it 75% of the time. We all eat things that are inflammatory sometimes. But if the majority of the time you'll try to eat foods that are more on the anti-inflammatory list and not on the pro-inflammatory list, I mean, even 50-75% of the time, it's going to make a huge difference at you living a long, healthy, disease-free life. And so when we get back from break, I'm going to have the opposite list, the anti-inflammatory diet. So when we get back, we're going to go through 5 or 6. In fact, let me see. I have 7 things that you can add to your diet that are all very anti-inflammatory. And if you just do it 75% of the time, it'll make a huge, huge difference.